Today being Isru Chag, coming in continuation to Chag Shavuos. Never mind that we know, especially when it comes to Shavuos, it's up until Yud Beis Sivan. That's Behemshech to Shavuos. But of course, more specifically, Isru Chag. So I'd like to discuss a portion of a maamar relating to Shavuos that I actually had the opportunity to chazer yesterday. Some of the shuls in Chabad and Crown Heights that aren't necessarily makbid anymore to chazer a maamar every week shall show this time Rebbe Maharash and the end of Shabbos, but the end of Yom Tov might be makbid a bit more, and that's the case where the shul where I usually speak Shabbos afternoon. So for the end of Shavuos, the conclusion of Shavuos, chazer a maamar. And I don't limit myself in terms of which Rebbe and which maamar to chazer. Certainly the Rebbe himself chazered maamar from different Rebbeim over the years. So once again, I found myself looking through the Rebbe Maharash's maamar, looking to see if there's a nice, like I've described it before, a paralyzed maamar. And once again, I found something sort of buried at the end of one of the Sfarim, at the end of Sefer Tafresh Lamed Hey. I found a maamar of the Rebbe Maharash that I'm going to discuss shortly. Before I continue to that, I'll just mention in passing that I guess you could say als Histatfus in Kinus Torah, the Rebbe spoke about having an event, Matzeh Yom Tov, so Matzeh Pesach, Matzeh Shavuos, Matzeh Sukkos, to have shiurim in Torah. The Rebbe himself would do mishtatef in the Kinus Torah. So let's say at the Verbringen on Shavuos, the Rebbe would say an inyan and halacha to be mishtatef in the Kinus Torah for Matzeh Shavuos. Punkt picked up one of the volumes of Sichas Kodesh over Yom Tov, and I'm not sure right now exactly which year, one of the Lameds, I think the late Lameds, but Punkt Tzad, the shtatfus of the Rebbe that year for Kinus Torah was the Rebbe was meorer about not doing surgeries, not scheduling surgeries for Erev Shabbos. He says it's essentially akin to scheduling a trip by ship in Erev Shabbos. We know the halacha, you're not supposed to start a trip 3 days before Shabbos. And the Rebbe was marchiv on that. So one of the ha'aris, one of the chidushim of the Rebbe in halacha, one of the inyanim where the Rebbe was meorer, about an inyan in halacha that people are nizar in. And the Rebbe said it was sparked by a request for davening that he received from someone, and they told the Rebbe they're scheduling their surgery for vacation time. They're waiting until after work, and they're scheduling it for a Friday. And the Rebbe said, okay, if it's an emergency, it's einzach, but here you're scheduling it in advance, and you have the liberty of doing so, which wasn't the case in the past. So it may have not come up in halacha and halachic discussions because you didn't quite have scheduled surgeries months in advance, but today you do. And so the Rebbe was meorer about that. That was the Rebbe's Histatfus in Kinus Torah that year, but interesting discussion, the way the Rebbe talks about it. A lot of interesting ways that Rebbe expresses himself there in that discussion. So als minor Histatfus in Kinus Torah, I'll just mention in passing that there's actually an interesting discussion to be had about the practice in Chabad, and I assume in many other Chassidus as well, that there's a maamar of B'tzeis HaChag, which is roughly akin to the maamar of Chassidus, Rebbe Maharash on a Shabbos. Now, there's really a question of the Seudus on Shabbos. Litvish Welt, I'm going to use them as the stand-in for this, for the following mahalach. I don't know if it's so simplistic, but in the Litvish Welt, as far as I'm aware, so they're very makbid on the inyan of shalosh seudus, and so they wash for a meal, whether it's before chatzos or after chatzos, but they have their main meal. And then they're very makbid sometime in the afternoon, last hour or two before Shabbos is over. They wash again, they sit down. Usually it's not heavy chashav machal, not chashav suda, but the ikar is to wash, to show you're having a suda shlishis. Chassidic Welt, one of the innovations of the Chassidic Welt was to prave Shavuos together in shul, the Beis Medrash, and that's often when the Rebbes would say Torah or their Iker Torah. It seems to go back to the Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov would prave Suda Shlishis with the Chavraya. Interestingly, saw recently that the Chassam Sofer used to also prave Suda Shlishis which perhaps could bolster those who wish to see certain commonalities between the Chassam Sofer and the Chassidische Welt. So it seemed to me that could have been a chiddush that the Chassam Sofer did this. And in fact, it says that in the earlier years, the Chassam Sofer, that would be the one time the Chassam Sofer would speak in Rosen the Torah, would speak most overtly in inyan Kabbalah, inyan Pnimius, and then in later years he stopped speaking so overtly due to the crowd. He didn't think the crowd was worthy, it was appropriate to speak that way for the crowd that he had. But interesting that the Chassam Sofer had azam min hanhaga, and it would be interesting to explore. We know the Chassam Sofer, of course, had links to a certain type of tenuas hachasidus in Germany, Rebbe Adler. He would have run into the Baal HaFlaw as well, though the Baal HaFlaw status itself is obviously debated somewhat. But it would be interesting to explore whether it is possible to draw a line in some way between Hanhagas HaChassam Sofer and this inyan and Hanhagas Tenuas HaChassidus. Not to shoehorn the Chassam Sofer into being a chassid, but for the Hungarian world, who are in a way half Chassam Sofer, half Chassidim, so they certainly like to see a certain commonality. And it's really its own discussion, just mentioning it in passing, but the yachas, the connection between the Chassam Sofer and Chassidus, and the Chassam Sofer and Kabbalah, Primus HaTorah, is its own fascinating discussion. At any rate, so Chassidim do that. I haven't gone and checked whether the average Chassidish Yid out there is washing at this Shalosh or this Tish or not, if they're makbid or not makbid, how much of the inyan, how much of what's going on there is stuff about the food. But they also may have Tish on Friday night, and so it all has to be analyzed and understood in context. I'm not so bahav and so familiar. When it comes to Chabad, there's the maimed of gathering at the time of Shalosh Shodas. At this point, almost as far as I know, Stam Chabad shuls don't have any food at this maimed. Growing up in Borough Park in the Tzemach Tzedek Shul Grade, the Rav, Rabbi Rosenfeld, Al Vashalom, just passed away. Was still makbid, I assume behemshech to his shver, Rabbi Simpson, was makbid actually to put down food for Shalosh Shodas, daven mincha time, to put down food for Shalosh Shodas and to wash. So that itself seems to perhaps be edus of an alternate minig in Chabad to be makbid. And I've tried looking into earlier sources, which are scarce. You have to sort of scrape them together from here and there. What Shalosh Shodas looked like in Chabad a few days ago. It seems like they would gather either in the shul, in the Cheder Sheni, or in someone's house. There may not have always been food, maybe sometimes there was food. Hagufa, I thought maybe if it was in someone's house, it may have been because there was food. I have a suspicion that Amal, they were makbid more not to eat in shul. Stamazai, using shul for eating and for food and for kiddush is itself a questionable thing. I'm pretty sure Litvish are makbid not to do it. These are all different discussions that are somewhat connected and are all worthy of their own separate exploration. At any rate, it's interesting to consider the Tzeis HaChag in the Litvish world, the Chassidische world, the Chabad world. Dafkin Chabad, Tzeis HaChag almost seems to have a bigger chashivus. Again, I don't know if everyone has food. I think it might be slightly more common to bring food to the Maimed Tzeis HaChag. Obviously, Sudas Mashiach, Hachin Shal Pesach became its own thing, but even Matzi Shavuos, I think more shuls are more likely in Chabad to bring foods to the Maimed Tzeis HaChag. And I haven't delved and dived into all the Makaitis that may be shaykh to this. This is more off the top of the head, but I think that there's often value in zooming out, presenting a general idea, a general framework, looking at the bigger picture, and then you can fill it in with the particular Makaitis. So I haven't gone and checked whether there are clear Makaitis in Chabad that say there's an inyan to bring food or not. But just within the larger context of Vima Pravit Shabbos, Vima Pravit Yom Tif, it's interesting that Chabad is almost mahader more in a sort of Suda Shlishis for Yom Tif, for at least B'tzei Chag, the last day, more than Shabbos. And this whole question of what exactly is the gather of the Achila and Shabbos versus Yom Tov. Shabbos, you have the Gimel Sudas. Yom Tov, it's usually not stated that way, although the Rambam does seem to say V'chein b'Yom Tov, so it's quoted often as the Rambam says there is, but other poskim say there's not. So again, Litvish should take it very literally. Okay, the poskim say there's not, so we're not going to wash. There's no Shalosh Shudas on Yom Tov. But if you look at the description of the Rambam for Shabbos B'chlal and for Yom Tov, and you see the description of Yom Tov as it's quoted in the Torah, in Siman Tov Kuf Chav Tes, and even in Alter Rebbe in Siman Tov Kuf Chav Tes, the way the Chetzil, in the context of Chetzil Hashem, Chetzil Lechem, so the way it's described is, you get up early, you daven early, and you have this Habayker, probably before Chatzos, and then you go back to Shul, to Beis Medrash, and you sit and learn, and then you go home and you continue Besuda until Yom Tov is out. That language is still quoted in the Alter Rebbe in Siman Tov Kuf Chav Tes. In that context of Chetzel Hashem, Chetzel Hashem, it's essentially describing three Sudas, which the Rambam mentioned also in the more formal formulation that there's three Sudas, but it's also in the description of the whole Malach Hayoim. And the assumption is you got up early, daven early, you want to eat in the morning, you're not going to sit and eat the whole day, that's pasnish, so you have to go back to the Shana learn, but then you'll continue eating. Obviously, the whole schedule of the Shabbos day and the Yom Tov day has changed over time and depends from community to community. Obviously, in Chabad, no one's having a proper meal before Chatzos anyway. Shavuos punkt, you have side the milchiks and side the fleishiks if you're makbid to eat both, so that itself can draw out your suda much longer than usual. So you have a longer suda, a longer chatzir lechem. It seems like Litvish Avelt Bechlal might be more makbid on cheshbening the chatzir Hashem, the chatzir lechem, and Chabad I haven't seen as a min sprach. Obviously, I guess depends on the person and how they fill their day, and obviously the Rebbe gave people what to do, talucha the first day or the b'tzei Chag on the second day. So it depends on how you're counting the b'tzei Chag. Is that the chatzir Hashem? Is that the chatzir lechem? You can have fun with that question. So part of the question to me is, I hope this is easy to follow and not too circular or rambling. But part of the question to me is, what is the gather of these sudas, whether it's Shabbos, whether it's Yom Tov? We can pose it as a hakira. Is the ikar inyan that right? Let's say you're machab the guest in very formal upper class settings. That someone's hosting a guest. And they throw a party in honor of the guest. So that's how you're machab the guest. You machab the guest by throwing a party in their honor. And if you really want to be machab them, so you throw multiple parties in their honor. So Lamer Zagin, one Eirech you're machab, you throw two parties in their honor. Another Eirech you're machab, you throw three parties in their honor. So it's a bigger chshivas, you threw three parties in their honor. Each party has to follow the klalim of the party, the dress code, and what the courses are and how they're served, and which in Torah you have Mesachas Derech Eretz. This the Derech Eretz Shabbos Suda has a whole art in Torah. So the question is again, without looking into all the Mar Makoimis, I think it's important to throw out a potential possible larger framework in advance, and then you go look be'iyun. So is the ikar vart that you're throwing three parties in honor of Shabbos, and in Dem Gufa, and this specifically, you could say that the Litvisha world takes it a bit literally and technically. So let's say the Suda Shlish is not so much of a Suda B'etzem. It's kind of being done because it has to be checked off the box. People are not looking for a big Suda at that point in the day. They don't have a big chashiv machalim like they had for the other two Sudas. That itself is a discussion, which Sudas should be more chashiv, if any. There's also the whole issue if you're counting the Kiddush or not, once the Kiddush was invented, which is its own discussion. Is that just a small snack, or some people have a heavy Kiddush? Without getting into all of that. So if you're washing, so washing is sort of seen as the technical Evan Abaychim, whether it's a Suda or not. Okay, you washed, checked it off. But okay, if the ikar is to show the covet, so I don't know if taking it a bit technically is showing that kind of covet per se, from my perspective. That's one way of looking at it. Or another way of looking at it maybe is it's not so much the formal throwing parties. It's maybe the Shabbos is a time to sit and enjoy and people sit and enjoy when they're sitting at a Suda. So you're supposed to fill Shabbos and Yom Tov with Sudas, and obviously you're not going to eat nonstop, so you're probably going to eat at night, and that's all the time there is. And then you'll probably eat in the morning. For some people it's mamash in the morning, or for some it's already after chatzos, but that's the first main meal of the day. And you're not going to eat all day, so you have to go to a shul, you have to go learn, and then you come back, and so then you continue eating. From the Rambam's descriptions, it sounds a bit to me a bit more like the latter. That that's the chashivas, that you're filling the day with sudas. So that might have ramifications for how seriously we're treating Shalosh Sudas, and whether there is an inyan to be makbid to check it off the list, or if it doesn't fit into how your day is going at that point, or if at this point we conclude the day with ruchnias. So lav dafka, we see the need to dafka emphasize the gashmis at this point. These are just some thoughts off the top of my head, and that's my nebulous contribution to Kinus Torah. At any rate, going back to the point, yesterday would say Chag. So Chazar a maamar that I found in the back of Sefer Tafresh Lamed Hey, and it's in the back because the Maharash didn't write it. It's it seems like the Rebbe Maharash, certain maamar each year, didn't get around to writing or whatever. We know from some Chassidus that sometimes he would be prompted, perhaps on the spot, to maybe say something unplanned. So maybe that was why he didn't write certain ones, or whatever the case is, whatever the exact seder was. But there's certain maamar that it seems he didn't write formally. There was a system in place, and he had a Shmuel Sefer was his scribe, and they had a seder where he would write it, and Shmuel Sefer would copy it, and it would be released in some limited form. At any rate, this was not written, but we have what's called the hanacha. As usual with Rebbe Maharash, it's an anonymous hanacha. So it doesn't seem like we know who wrote it, but this is one of the manuscripts we have. It says on top of the maamar, this is from Chag Shavuos Tafresh Lamed Hey. And the Tibur Maschel begins V'daber Lekim. It's called Ramela Leimor Anochi, and that's the maamar. I came across it yesterday. I said, "Oh, this looks like a good one. I'm gonna chazer this." So when I say chazer, I mean I'll be honest. It's late to Steiger today, not memorizing it entirely, but you go through it, you have it pretty clear, and then you say it in Yiddish while you making use of the Sefer B'Shas Maisa as well. But that's at this point, that's kind of the default anyway for most people. So that's what I went with, and I thought there was some very interesting geschmacka parts to it. Now, I like to always give a bit of a bibliographic introduction. Where does the meorer fit in? What's it based on? Interestingly, in this case, the maamar there's no maamar kaimis, there's nothing, no information, and it's Yom Tov, so it's hard to start searching. What's interesting about the maamar is what I would say is perhaps the chief characteristic about it is how much it uses the pasuk in Sefer Devarim. I believe the pasuk is something along the lines of Al haaretz heracha es ishay hagdoila. Interesting pasuk, not a top 10 pasuk that everyone knows in their sleep. Going through Tikkun Shavuos, I noticed that the deeper one got into Devarim, the less familiar a lot of the psukim felt compared to psukim from the earlier Svarim, which is interesting to me. It just it's interesting that Devarim is a memutza, I guess, between the rest of the Chumshei Torah and the rest of Nach. So in a way, it feels that way to me. That it feels a little bit more like opening another sefer of Nach, so certain parts of it. So this pasuk, which is not a common pasuk, not a famous pasuk, this pasuk mamash is the binyan of the maamar keeps on coming back to this pasuk and uses the pasuk in different ways, teaches it chassidic in different ways, which is interesting. So after Yom Tov, I went and searched, and I found that it's talking not a very common maamar. What I did find is that the Rebbe Maharash also said and wrote this maamar the year before Tafresh Lamed Daled for Parshas Yisrei, because it could be a Yisrei maamar. It's called Ramei Leimor. And they're Mitzayin that it's based on a maamar actually directly of the Alter Rebbe, which itself seemed like a chiddush to me. So I thought that Rebbe Maharash usually is basing himself on maamar with Tzemach Tzedek, not directly on maamar with Alter Rebbe. And in this particular case, it looks like a maamar with Alter Rebbe that may not even be from after Petterberg, from the Yadi, may even be from before. It doesn't have a particular date. It's printed in the Moyad Marzak and Parshis. And there are 3 nuschos there. One is longer and 2 are shorter, which also just seems like a hallmark of an earlier maamar. So maybe that's why the maamar caught my eye. It seemed interesting. It seemed unique. It seemed different. I seem to have an eye for that. So even though in Tafish Lamed Hey, it's a hanachot, so it's already through the prism of how the Rebbe Maharash said it. And as I saw, there are differences between how the Alter Rebbe originally said it and how it was written and how the Rebbe Maharash repeated it b'dibur, but some of it still comes across. It seemed more unique, more geschmack to me. So I could be meidach. I could go on a bit about the bibliography of the different maamarim. There's also one other place we find this teichen is in Tafresh Samach Vav, Yisrei Samach Vav, but it's not part of the Hamshich Samach Vav. So today it's in the separate volume of Mamori Samach Vav Samach Zayin. And there we don't have the complete maamar. So it's interesting that we have the Alter Rebbe, the lengthy version and the shorter versions. We have Tafresh Lamed Daled, which begins with the Rebbe Maharash's writing, but then it seems that he only got up until a certain point, and the rest was copied from the Alter Rebbe. We have the Rebbe Maharash in Samach Vav also, where he rewrote the beginning and he added the whole shtickle, but also it sort of ends, I don't know if it's in the same place, but also towards the beginning. And then we have Tafresh Lamed Hey, which is someone writing how the Rebbe Maharash actually said it over b'dibur, which is somewhat reminiscent of the last maamar of the Rebbe Maharash that we spoke about, where it's also like hard to find. First of all, it's rare, and second of all, it's on the one hand you have the hanacha from the Rebbe Maharash here, and you have the hanacha of the Rebbe Maharash. So there's a dibur there. So here also you have the Alter Rebbe, the version from the Alter Rebbe originally, and then you don't have a complete written version from the Rebbe Maharash or a complete written version from the Rebbe Shab. Then you have this hanacha. So perhaps there's a pattern there. It wasn't intentional. At any rate, I want to share a particular point that I found interesting from this maamar, which I think gets at a sort of conundrum, perhaps, that perhaps we could, if we want to be so bold, to say that the Chabad movement finds itself a bit trapped in, and it's really been a conundrum since the beginning. And that is how to balance wanting to have your own ambitions, wanting to have your own growth in Avodas Hashem, to think of yourself, to frame yourself as someone who is an Oved Hashem, mevakish in Avodas Hashem, versus the bittul, not having yeshes, and not thinking that you're a big Oved and a big chashva and a tzaddik and all that. So there's a lot of negative programming in Chabad writing, Chabad tradition, against thinking you're someone or you're something. But I was just discussing this with my father yesterday. I hope and assume he doesn't mind that I'm using our conversation to this end to quote it, to discuss it, to build on it. But we were talking about this precisely this conundrum before I'd come across the maamar afterwards, and talking about how it seems that Chabad is a rich meorer of Avodas Hashem, but yet it feels that things have gotten sort of painted into a corner to a certain extent, and Chabad has this interest, this desire to attract people to its teachings, and Chabad has this knowledge, this awareness that the Chabad teachings are very attractive, or could be very attractive to someone who's searching in Avodas Hashem. Yeah, we also find that there's also something of an impasse where there's a bit of a gap between the theory, the soaring language of what's possible, versus the reality of what's being offered. Meaning, if someone is searching for derech in Avodas Hashem, it's a bit tricky to market the actual derech as opposed to the idea, the notion, the concept of the derech. And what we're finding is that, in my knowledge or my experience, and sometimes I have a larger perspective on what's happening in other places, is that Torah's Chabad has perhaps never been more popular in the sense that just as when the Alter Rebbe began, he obviously, the way I see it, is he started with a group of Mavakshim. Alter Rebbe himself was a Mavakish, and there were other Mavakshim. They were looking for a Derech Rebbe Hashem. There were some ideas out there, Kabbalah, Primus HaTorah, but they were lacking direction, and Alter Rebbe discovered the Magid, and then shaped a Derech from what he learned from the Magid that was somewhat unique. And that's a separate discussion of Chassidus Chabad versus other streams of Chassidus, which maybe is a topic to talk about soon. But the Alter Rebbe was dealing with a certain segment of the population, meaning look at 100% of the population at the time. Of that population, a certain percentage were being Isaac in Tefillah with Kavanas Harizal, were being Isaac in other anhagas of this sort, and a certain percentage were not really interested. Of the percentage that were interested, a certain percentage became chassidim, or maybe they even managed to attract groups of people who hadn't previously been excited or interested, and convince them that they should also be excited and interested about how Chassidus is shaping these anhagas and creating something unique. But ultimately, Chassidus always was a group of people, or certainly at the beginning was a group of people that are mevakshim, that are interested in pursuing this derech. And so, in other words, just as schools today will do an aptitude test to sort of give people guidance on what they want to do in life. So if there was some kind of spiritual aptitude test administered at the time, so those who exhibited a certain pre-existing interest in Avodas Hashem, in pursuing that aspect of Yiddishkeit, of life, they would have been extremely likely to pursue one of the options in the new world of Chassidus. And it would seem that throughout the first few generations, it was still very fluid and very dynamic. So if a father had that aptitude and his son did not, it was very easy for the son to slip back out of that identity and rejoin the mainstream, and vice versa. Every door where there were new Mavakshim who could be born to whichever family, Chassidus was a viable option if they saw it as filling that need. The way I see it today is that that has not changed. The world is still full of Mavakshim in pretty much, I would say, the same sense, the same tradition. People of all persuasions, doesn't matter whether it could be even within parts of the Chassidic world that don't feel that the environment that they're in actually feels like one of being Mevakish and Avodas Hashem. So they're trying to look for something that feels more real. Or within the so-called Litvisha, the Yeshivisha world, where there's sort of the party line, the official stance, which is not to focus per se on Inyan Avodas Hashem in that sense, but there is certainly a large number who are interested, and it does not seem like it is strongly discouraged if someone wants to learn on their own time, learn different svarim, different chiburim, hear different shiurim. Obviously, your specific mileage may vary depending on who your immediate parents or chaverim or which yeshiva you're in, but certainly once you get to a certain point, you have the independence. And there is a tremendous number of Mavakshim today. And certainly Chabad in the last 50, 60, 70 years was sort of still working with that. There was still, if you look 75 years ago, there still was a certain fluidity. Many Talmidim who came to Lubavitcher Meistes, or who were born to Lubavitcher families, decided that this derech was not for them, this identity was not for them. It's an interesting topic to discuss, how it's sort of forgotten or underemphasized, how fluid, how many people were walking out of Chabad in the 50s and the 60s, people who had gotten up to a certain point in the Meistes, or maybe even close to marriage and sort of drifted away. So that identity was still fluid, and it doesn't seem like Chabad was desperate to hold on to every person. And vice versa, that Chabad was still at that time making inroads in different yeshivas. The shiurim had a chance of really making a marked difference, and if someone was a mavakish of that nature, there was a good chance that they would be drawn to this derech halacha l'maisa. What we're finding today is that that seems to have come to a standstill. So on the one hand, I think Chabad Svarim have never been more popular. I think you go to any community, you go to a place like Lakewood, and I think it's a safe guess, safe to assume that there may be hundreds of people there that are being me'ayin in Sefer Chabad, but maybe they have chavrusa from their own background, or they have a chabura, or they don't, or whatever. Everyone's taking it which way they like to take it, but it seems like it's gotten sort of severed from the movement, and that in some sense the movement does not seem to be offering a viable derech, an attractive derech in Avodas Hashem, practically speaking, with Payal Mamish, that people would want to be drawn to. This is obviously I'm trying to say it in Eid Leverter, but this is something of an issue, and obviously requires some self-awareness and some self-reflection, which isn't always so easy. Actually, I was thinking recently of doing a whole talk on the question of self-awareness and how good is self-awareness, or is it beneficial, is it harmful? This could tie into many larger questions of mental wellness, mental illness, mental challenges, spiritual challenges. So that itself is its own interesting question. To some extent, I think it's fair to say that being a good from chassidic yid requires lowering the dose of self-awareness in certain respects. So that itself is interesting. So it might be hard to engage in that. But on the other hand, we have Makaitis about cheshbon nefesh, and sometimes we need to have a communal cheshbon nefesh. At any rate, I'm not calling for an urgent gathering for cheshbon nefesh, but I'm just being meorer, just raising the point, raising the issue. And I think part of the issue is that Chassidus Chabad obviously has a very rich tradition, heritage of Avodas Hashem, but part of that means acting on what the Sfarim are prescribing, and it feels like in some respect, to some extent, we've been painted into a corner in that we feel that a lot of what the Sfarim are describing, what they're prescribing, is not accessible. It's not something that can be implemented practically. So we enjoy, we learn about it, we read about it, we know it exists. That itself gives us up as a musig of something greater. But otherwise, we'll leave it at that. Part of the issue, I think, uniquely within Chabad, but maybe would have been true within the rest of Chassidus as well, is that this conundrum. On the one hand, you have Chassidus starting off as a movement of mevakshim, and like I said, I think today, Ad Yom Hazeh, you have there's always a certain percentage of Klal Yisrael that are active mevakshim. Obviously, you can argue and say that Chassidus can be beneficial to everyone, and everyone can benefit from it in some way. But usually, it's the active mevakshim that are more interested in taking more upon themselves, whether in learning or in hanhaga. So, Chassidus has historically been driven by mevakshim. On the other hand, Chassidus Chabad seems to have some negative messaging about thinking too much of yourself, of making too big a deal of yourself, of thinking that you're on a path of growth and you're going to reach great heights. To the extent that sometimes within Chabad, when someone in Chabad will encounter that type of language from someone on the outside, that itself will sort of will be coded as, oh, that's a non-Chabad outlook. So if someone will come and say, okay, I want to join Chabad, I want to be masig madregas, I want to have avavayera. So some of the avatars there might be triggered into saying, oh, that's not a Chabad sentiment. That sounds like something a not Lubavitcher would say. But obviously, the Svarim, and certainly the earliest Svarim, the Alter Rebbe's Torah, of course, is full of the discussion of how to achieve avavayera. And clearly he was talking to an audience that wanted to achieve that. And they were asking, and he was emphasizing that, yes, of course, this is very important. We must do this, and this is extremely necessary. So I found it interesting that I think this part of this maamar that the Rebbe Maharash said in Tofish Lamed Daled and Tofish Lamed Hey, which goes back to what the Alter Rebbe said in some undated year. I didn't go check extensively to see maybe there is a year, but it's not printed in the Svarim from the years. It's just Mamori Ad Merzak and Parshias, so for Parshas Yisrei. So there's a part there that I think actually touches where the Alter Rebbe, within the span of a few lines, seems to touch on this conundrum from both sides. Now, a big section, maybe the bulk of the maamar, concerns the meorer tlas ksharim miskashron da beda eraisa kchabruchu v'Yisrael, but with the hamshech v'kulu darga al darga sasim v'galia. I recall, I don't remember the Rebbe Maharash, but I think the Rebbe has maamarim that talk about the sasim and the galia. So this is a theme in Chassidus, surely in other places as well. But there's a unique explication of these ideas here in this particular maamar, where it goes through for each darg, explains what's pshat that Kutshabrichu has sasim v'galia, and that Eraisa has sasim v'galia, and that Yisrael has sasim v'galia, and each one is interesting. There are also, that's, as we know, the Ramarim often have layers. There's a Dibra Maskal, there's a first question, a second question, a third question. So I'm not getting into the whole structure of the maamar. And I think often in these talks and these recordings, often I find myself seeking to break away from being beholden to the structure of the maamar, instead of trying to zero in on particular sections that I think could pack a punch, if we're allowed to say that. So in this case, I want to focus in that part of the maamar, which is the bulk of the maamar. I want to focus most specifically on his discussion of Yisrael sasim v'galia. So he explains Kutshabrichu sasim v'galia is galia is like the olam hadibur, versus sasim is the olam hamachshava, which is the truth b'sari achza. That's of course within the human experience as well. So the olam is this galia, that's galia, and sasim is sasim. But without getting into all the details of that, but he has a lot to say. Both the Alter Rebbe or the Rebbe Maharash have a lot to say on that count. Then there's a discussion of Eraisa sasim v'galia, and there's a very interesting segment there, particularly in the way the Rebbe Maharash says it, where the Rebbe Maharash addresses the Mishnah of a machlef parav b'chamar, and says that in Gan Eden they don't learn a kipshutei, and those who know a little history will know that the Frierdiker Rebbe got into a whole parsha with Hakriya V'Kedusha over something relating to expressing that point that was taken to be very controversial by the Olam HaYeshivas at the time. And I think that's worthy of its own discussion. There's a good chance that I could do a separate discussion on that soon, but we'll see. So it turns out, from what I'm seeing as a result of going through this maamar and looking into it, it seems like the Rebbe Maharash actually is the one who created this formulation about hamachlef parav b'chamar, and he repeated it a number of times in very strong terms, and that's its own discussion. So that's Eraisa sasim v'galia. But then there's an interesting discussion about Yisrael sasim v'galia, and for the purpose of this discussion, I'm actually going to focus more on how it's formulated by the Alter Rebbe and copied in Tofish Lamed Daled, versus how the Rebbe Maharash seems to have repeated it in Tofish Lamed Hey. It is fascinating in its own right to compare Ksav to Dibur, or how the Alter Rebbe said it versus how the Rebbe Maharash said it. Very interesting stuff. But I want to focus, especially since we've been Maidach in the Hakdamas, somehow it always happens, the Hakdamas end up being very lengthy. I want to focus at this point very narrowly just on this segment in the Alter Rebbe. Practically, though, I'm actually holding the Tofish Lamed Daled in my hand, because that section of the maamar in Tofish Lamed Daled is copied directly from the Alter Rebbe, and so it's should be largely word for word. There might be some minor differences, but I'm using the way it appears in Tofish Lamed Daled. And in the discussion there of Yisrael sasim v'galia, there are a number of interesting points that I'm going to dwell on, and the main point, like I mentioned, is about what I consider to be this conundrum of being caught between having ambition and not having ambition. So the Alter Rebbe says, or the Rebbe Maharash says, Yisrael sasim v'galia. What's pshat that Yisrael has sasim and galia? The way that Rebbe Maharash repeated it in Tofish Lamed Hey, he also emphasized that malachim don't have sasim v'galia. They have pnimius and chitzonius, but they don't have sasim v'galia. And Alter Rebbe, I didn't see it emphasized klar. So that's an interesting example of the Rebbe Maharash adding a clarifying point and a clarifying detail. Not only that, in Alter Rebbe's original, he seems to also use pnim interchangeably with sasim, whereas the Maharash seems to draw a sharp distinction. He says, what's sasim v'galia? So he says, galia is a person's external hanhaga. He says, pirash mashenigla le'ein koil. What's visible to all, seder hanhaga ba'teva sheyeshnei b'chol habruim. Well, specifically, it's or generally, it's for all creations, all creatures. Their external behavior, masha'echlim v'shaisim. That's the galia, and afilu for a yid, whatever his hanhaga and teva is, that's his galia. And so whether it's begashmius or even in his avodas Hashem, his seder avodas Hashem, v'yirasoi, mashaloimid, u'mispalel, it's all that's all an expression represented. We can describe it, we can tag it as the revealed energy, the galia of the yid. Interestingly, this point isn't directly to the point I set us up for in my introduction, but there's also a very interesting point here that I didn't want to skip. He quotes, he's throughout the discussion here, he's quoting different psukim, also from Merkavas Yecheskel, and one of the psukim that he quotes, Alter Rebbe quotes it, the Rebbe Maharash sort of skips this part actually, it says, El asher shama haruach lelechas yilechu, lo yusabu belechtan. That sort of the direction the wind carries them, that's the direction they go. They don't turn around, they don't seek to stray from their path, from their route. So the Alter Rebbe says a very interesting point. He says this tells us, we're talking about the galia of a person, and we're talking about the route, the path. He says that's the lesson here, the message here is, Shelo Yosef miderech zu lederech acheres, levakesh eitzav etachpula acheres, ladas b'meh yaved Hashem. A person shouldn't be casting about from one derech to another to seek a method, some other approach to serving Hashem. Rak el asher shama ruach elikis yesh bo me'es Hashem ki hakorl b'yad Hashem. The language here is a bit, some of it is a bit hard to parse word for word, but the general gist is asher sham haruach, the direction that God takes you in. So that's me'es Hashem, hakorl b'yad Hashem, and that's all the galia. That's the shegila, that the Eibshter is being megala, and the revealed energy that you receive, the revealed energy that you exude, that's the path you're supposed to be on. Mes hakorl also yafen be'itoy, which is a pasuk in Kehelas. So everything's the right time, the right place. And he says, "K'chein b'chol makim shehu sham, kach hizmin lo Hashem yisbarach, shesham yashar yechazu faneimoi, lirois darchei hakodesh." This actually sounds like a very interesting lashon, like almost a malitza, that Hashem puts you exactly where you need to be, and that's from that place. That's where you'll see God, you'll see Hashem. So it's interesting what exactly the Alter Rebbe, I'm attributing it to the Alter Rebbe here, especially because the Rebbe Maharash seems to have skipped it in Tavish Lamed Hey. But it's interesting to consider what exactly the Alter Rebbe is addressing here, because the Alter Rebbe, especially in the earlier Drushim, spoke very much to the point. It was less about the external packaging. Even you compare Tavish Lamed Hey to the way the Alter Rebbe said it originally, much more of what the Alter Rebbe said sounds like it's like a direct, ongoing, relentless message of what a person should think about, what a person should internalize, whereas in the Rebbe Maharash's maamar, a big chunk of it just seems like it's a larger framework, and then there are the parts where it gives the guidance. So this particular point here, the Alter Rebbe seems to be addressing some kind of practical question, some practical concern. So my understanding, my impression is that often talking about mavakshim. So obviously there's got to be some. All the chassidim who joined Chassidus obviously had to have they changed paths to some extent. So I don't think the Alter Rebbe means that, but you still have your life circumstances. You still are on a certain track in life. Sometimes we find in the larger culture you have people that have their midlife crisis and they change tracks completely in life. People are unhappy, unsettled with their track in life, with their lot in life. And the same could be for Mavakshim as well. Maybe Dafka Mavakish is likely to be unhappy, unsettled, and wish to seek some new radical derech, and completely turn around their life circumstances in the process. And it seems like the Alter Rebbe is saying that at some point you have to make peace with your derech, your lot in life, and whatever that revealed energy is, that galia that you're receiving, the galva that you're exhibiting, you're exuding, that's more or less the derech for you, and you have to make peace with that. And the sentiment generally is familiar in the sense of that the path Hashem sends you in life. That's an idea I think we're more generally familiar with. It's certainly mentioned in Chassidus, emphasized in Chassidus, that person's Hashem it's Hadegeret Kainanu, and particularly in Chabad, you have your shlichus, and even if you're in the middle of nowhere, so your shlichus is in the middle of nowhere to be makar of the people in the middle of nowhere. And you can always find who to be makar, who to be mashpia on in that sense. So that's a point you hear. But here it seems turned a bit more internally to someone who is a bit restless, someone who is mavakish, as I framed it. So I think a person like that, the Alter Rebbe is putting his foot down and sending the message that you don't have to keep on looking for new eitzes, new tachbulas. At some point, it is about the way the wind is carrying you, but obviously, as he's about to explain, you're not supposed to be passive, you're supposed to be active, but within the framework that you were placed in. So that itself is interesting. And that line, very evocative line for me. So that's the Galia. So what's the Sasim? The Sasim, and this the Rebbe Maharash also repeated in Tov Shlam, hey, he quotes the Gemara, Doiris Rishonim, also Terasin Keva, Machtan Arai, Doiris Achronim, also Machtan Keva, but Terasin Arai. So what's Pshat Keva, what's Pshat Arai? So he says, Keva Arai is this model, where the Alter Rebbe still calls it Pnim, but the Rebbe Maharash is more medayik to call it Sasim. He says, the Pnim, the Sasim, that's what you actually live for. Masha the mesim koliboy v'sichli b'zeh u'magamasei b'zeh ki zeh kol atzmusiyoy atzmusiyoy she'osim izeh ikar v'zeh ikar chayusoy. What do you actually live for? That's your pnim, that's your keva, that's your sasim. The arai is the stuff that you got to do because you got to check the boxes. You do it whether or not it could be bal karcha, libi bal imay. So the way the Alter Rebbe expresses it, and Rebbe Maharash repeated it, says, they also ate, they also drank, they also cohabited, they had children, but everything they did was derech arai. Hainu mitzad ha'hechrich ki'ilu kfoi shed, which is a strong line, and used in particular contexts, which the Alter Rebbe seems to invoke it for almost the whole gashmistic life, that the whole life is ki'ilu kfoi shed. And Rebbe Maharash also uses that line, repeats it, although he omits he says kilu kfoi v'chulu, because there's also, I guess, a sensitivity not to say the word. But I think in this context, la'olam yilamed derech ktsara, we have to be clear and not say things in hints. So that's how the Alter Rebbe and Maharash express it, that they also have to split their life between these parts of life, but that part is mitzad ha'hechrich. You do what you have to do. But their whole cheftzam, chukasam, what they lived for was to turn Avodas Hashem. The opposite is the Deiris HaAchreinim. And the Alter Rebbe connects it to a pasuk. It says, Kiponu Elai Oiref. It's a pasuk in Yirmiyah. It says, what's Pshat Kiponu Elai Oiref? So interesting, the Alter Rebbe teaches it. He says, it's Kiponu Elai. You're turning to me. And in the Tov Shlam, hey, there's actually a line in Yiddish. It's a chaker tzumir. You're turning to the Eibishter. But you're turning to the Eibishter with the Oiref. What's Pshat? You're turning to the Eibishter with the Oiref. He says, Panu Elai, Shalayimdim, Umispalim. You're doing the good things. You're doing the spiritual things. But what you're doing is with Chinas Oiref. You're doing it mitzad ha'hechrich. You're doing it because you feel like this is what you have to do. This is, you have no choice. This is in order to be a from a yid, in order to be a chassidic yid even. This is what you have to do. And I want to go back to this point later after I get to the other half of the coin of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. So that is, so he says sasim. The sasim is, the sasim in Yisrael is where your heart's really at, what you're actually excited about. And it should be terasan keva, then you're on the right track. Otherwise, you're on the wrong track. Interestingly, a bit further, the Alter Rebbe, the Maharash says, "Zeu kol ikar avodas ha'adam, sheyase kechayfetz hanitzitz." He talks about how every year has a nitzitz, but usually we're not in touch with the nitzitz, and we have the ruach shtos that covers it. But you have to get in touch with that nitzitz and do what the nitzitz wants. Not connect to the Eibishter with an oiref, but to connect the Eibishter with upon him. But then what does Alter Rebbe add? Alter Rebbe adds, but you shouldn't be satisfied that you're being an oivid, but you're being an oivid for zich. Clearly a translation from the Yiddish. You're being an oivid for zich, dinst the Eibishter for zich. Dahainu, shoroitzeli is tzadek or oivid. The vulsan at tzadek, the vulsan at oivid. That's not okay. Oh, you're being masig. Oh, I'm being masig. I'm getting hazim. I'm getting haba. It's the opposite of what the mechuven is, and this is there's also this association with shakar doesn't last. So he says lachim pa'amim shu mekatzer ba'avidasei. So someone like that, sometimes they're much short. They take a shorter time at what they should be involved in. Because it's all about himself. So when it's all about you, so then all of a sudden you're taking longer, you're taking shorter, whatever the exact mental process there is. Says that's all serving Hashem from the Galia, from the Erev. You have to serve Hashem with the Sasim, with the Pnimius, what the Nitzis wants to connect to the Eibishter. That's this section here of expressing this idea about Sasim and Galia. Interestingly, it goes on, particularly both Alter Rebbe, but particularly Rebbe Maharash, they go on to say that the Torah is given to everybody. Everyone has a sasim, even meorer who can't learn. They also have a sasim. So the Alter Rebbe says, Amaretz, Shaloim Yitzurufi Oisis HaTorah, Heim B'Tehillim, Heim B'Ma'amodus. Very interesting. Alter Rebbe B'Kitzur describes that the Pashta Mensch. So what does he say? He says Tehillim, he says Ma'amodus, which is something I would have to stop and explain, I guess, in Chabad what exactly Ma'amodus are. But that's also equivalent to, it also has the same effect. The way that Rebbe Maharash expresses that point is very, very powerful and is reminiscent of later talks by the Frierdiker Rebbe about the power of Amidas Tehillim and Pashta Mensch v'Zok Tehillim. And there's a line there from the Rebbe Maharash that what's the Pashta Mensch tut uf with Tehillim is like the same as Ke'echad Me'agdoilim. Which is also interesting to me to find the themes that the Frierdiker Rebbe emphasized, to find their sources, to find their roots, to find earlier expressions of this idea. So you have the Maharash expressing it, but really it goes all the way back to this line in the Alter Rebbe here, which you could easily miss. So that is also its own interesting discussion. But I think if you pay attention here, when the Alter Rebbe is talking about the Sasim and the Galia, I think within a short span of each other, I think the Alter Rebbe smacked around both sides of the conundrum. When the Alter Rebbe says that someone's only learning Mispal, Mitzara Hechrech, and the way that Maharash repeats it and expresses it, and it's very clear. That sounds very relatable. That you're a good guy. You're doing the things you got to be doing. But you ask yourself: is this what you look forward to? Is this what you live for? Or you got to do what you got to do. So that's Panuelai Oirev. But then the Alter Rebbe, in particular, I think that Maharash doesn't necessarily even mention this. But the Alter Rebbe then spins around a few lines later and says that if you're serving for zich, you want to be a tzaddik or an oivid, that's also you're serving yourself. That's also galia. That's also erev. It's not sasim. It's not the nitzitz. L'chayda, it's not the same thing. L'chayda, person who's wants to be a tzaddik and an oivid, so it sounds like he is excited. It sounds like he is into it. So this is not a repetition of the same point. In other words, this is making two separate points, but equating them to each other. And I think this gets at this point of if you drop all ambition, and I feel that to some extent that has become sort of a default where out of Chabad it's more okay to express that you have ambition. Now it could be there's yeshus, it could be it's the desire to be a tzaddik and a oivid and to score points on a scoreboard or whatever that means to different people. And so within Chabad there's certainly a desire to suppress that and to nip it in its bud. But on the other hand, the basic building blocks of getting anywhere, of accomplishing anything, of doing anything, is to have some kind of ambition, to have some kind of desire, and to not have that ambition, to not have that desire. So then it's mamish kipanu alay oiref. You're turning to the Eibishter with your oiref. You're not, your heart's not in it. So I think the Alter Rebbe naturally was talking to an audience of self-selecting ambitious people, mavakshim, people who were searching for Avodas Hashem. Maybe every now and then the Alter Rebbe visited a crowd of people that weren't thinking about it and tried to shake them up. We do have stories like that in the early days of Chassidus as well, where a chassid came to a place and threw a vart at them to shake them up, where they hadn't necessarily been actively questioning things, but then that statement or that question caused them to reconsider, to think about where they're holding in Avodas Hashem. But ultimately, generally speaking, the Alter Rebbe is speaking to a self-selecting group. Ultimately, those who came, who signed up, they had a desire. They want to get somewhere. So I think maybe that's something the Alter Rebbe doesn't necessarily need to emphasize as much. He's not talking to a low motivation group of people. He's talking to a high motivation group of people. At the same time, a very easy pitfall is to then make it all about yourself. And I was discussing this with my father. My father expressed, I think, in as many words, similar sentiment, that it's always you're always caught between these two impulses, and that's the conundrum of you're seeking, but then you have to nullify yourself. Of course, Chassidus doesn't lack for many opportunities to call yourself a meshukatz, a menovel, a metuav, and chatasi nagdi samid. So there's plenty there for feeling down as well. But essentially, if you look at it through this framework, you're sort of bouncing around these opposing sentiments, and they have to sort of keep each other in check. And again, so specifically in this case, step one is you have to be motivated, and I think that's in this case, the Alter Rebbe is actually saying both sides of the coin, which I find interesting, remarkable. Number one, you have to be motivated. If you're just going through Judaism, going through the motions, so then at some point I can start questioning. And if you're Chassidus, you have Chabad, but you're also just sort of going through the motions because you're afraid to stick your head up any further, or you're not motivated. So then that just sounds like the Chabad version of someone who's the stereotype of someone who's not Chabad, who's not Chassidus, stam going through life, stam going through the motions. So now we invented a Chabad way of going through life and going through the motions and checking off the boxes. So what's the difference between a Nusach Ashkenaz Yid who checks off the box and goes to shul and davens Shachris at 6 in the morning versus someone who checks off the box and goes to shul at 10 in the morning and then checks off the box of Tanya before and checks off the box of the rest of Chitas and Aram afterwards? What's exactly the difference? What's the distinction? Alter Rebbe in all his writings was talking about it should be animated, it should be alive, it should be three-dimensional. In order to do that, you have to have passion, you have to be excited, you have to be desirous of getting somewhere, of accomplishing something. Then immediately you get the pushback. Wait a second, who do you think you are? You think you're going to be a big tzaddik, a big ovid? Especially then that dar, you had people that were like expecting, like they wanted to reach the dark of tzaddik. That's why I say for Tanya is presumably counter-programming that and saying, no, you're never going to be a tzaddik, you'll be a beinoni, because you're talking to a crowd that they're coming with, they had the ambitions, they had shifas, they wanted to be tzaddikim. Alter Rebbe says, not so fast. So, and the beinoni in a nutshell is really being caught in that conundrum where you want to go further, but the pitfalls are so easy. If you think the wrong thing, you say the wrong thing. So, if anything, it's just yashos. So, I think this in particular, like I said, go back and you can see Tanya through that lens to some extent. But I think certainly in this drush in particular, it sort of becomes very stark, in that it's Alter Rebbe is calling out both sides of the coin, of the conundrum, that you can't be complacent. If you're complacent, then where's the Chassidus? What exactly? How does this constitute Chassidus? On the other hand, of course, there's always that caution not to think you become a big tzaddik and big ovid. But that counter-programming is so strong. We've gotten that part down pat. That part should be easy. If someone still is going to convince himself that they're a tzaddik and ovid, then it almost seems like a psychological problem. Maybe someone like that taka has to be kept away. Needs more supervision. It could be we've seen a few rare cases where you have someone in yeshiva who starts, as the Fidig Rebbe used to say, tappen gleich event, krichen of gleich event, crawling up the wall. You're not, you're living in demyonis. But aside from that, keeping that healthy, that negative message, which obviously has to be balanced properly as well. But that negative message of who do you think you are, and what do you think? Don't think you're all that. But at the same time, still channeling. You can't quash. You have to have that desire to accomplish. Certainly even in shlichus, which is a very important component of Chassidus Chabad today. Those who are more matzliach presumably have some form of greater ambition. Their ambition is expressing itself in this context of how many yidden they can affect. If you're going to go on shlichus and it's going to be ganzen kipanu elai oida, if you're going to go and it's going to checking off the boxes, which, maybe you could say to some extent some of the going of time every week for some people is checking off a box. So often that doesn't lead to major paytas and major connections, and people pass their route down from one person to the next one, and that's a bit more kipunalative. When someone is thrown out into foreign territory, out of town, and they have to sink or swim, so ambition is part of that. There's no way to eliminate that from the equation. And you can make perhaps a comparison to our previous discussion about the koyach hamisava, that the koyach hamisava does seem to be, perhaps can be said to be part of the equation of wanting to connect to God, is also sort of channeling an existing urge that could be seen as negative, but it needs to be channeled for the positive. And so just as that's the case there, and that's the case with shlichus, so presumably there has to be an element of that in Avodas Hashem as well. A person does have to want to have some desire, some she'ifa, and like I said, it is fairly universal, and it was universal, and that was always the building block, the bedrock of the chassidic movement, that you have to have some she'ifa in Avodas Hashem to connect to the Eibishter, and then you have to balance that with the opposing message. So that's my takeaway from this part of the maamar. Like I said, there are many other interesting points as well, but that's the one we're focusing on for now. Of course, as always, happy to hear thoughts and feedback.